Um, we are supposed to be talking about two books. They are interesting books that either by accident or knowing the author by design converge in their focus and ideas. A peculiarity of Prabir's. There are not that many engineers who understand that technology does not impinge on society in unidirectional ways. That there is a multidimensional framework in which technology impinges on society. Some of them are direct, some of them are indirect. So, this is why I'm going to tell the first story of Prabir that reflects appropriately badly on me. I don't know, 1999, 2000, the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace held an annual 2000, held an annual conference, and there were conference, so there were sessions and there were panel discussions and there was all sorts of stuff, and it was one of those sessions which talked about linkages between nuclear weapons and nuclear power and energy related issues. And I distinctly remember being in a session with Prabir and with Raghunandan of the Delhi Science Forum. All of us were at Delhi Science Forum at that time. In this event, and listening to the two of them and thinking to myself, I got it all wrong. Well, not wrong, but I got it all unidirectional. This whole notion of weapons and the intention of nuclear weapons, as well as the technologies of nuclear weapons, as well as the politics of nuclear weapons, needs to be unpackaged from issues around nuclear power. This is not to say that one needs to be uncritically rejecting weapons and uncritically accepting power, simply that these issues need to be discussed on their own ground, not necessarily conflated with each other. And I distinctly remember, it's 25 years ago, 24 years ago, I distinctly remember my sense of, if I hadn't listened to this nuanced conversation and discussion, I would have stayed uncritically using the same framework of critique for both of these interconnected but distinct issues. And that's my first story about Prabir that I hope makes what I'm calling a little point about the multidimensionality of science, technology, society, and democracy. So that's the first one. But, and here's the next issue. We all think, many of us think, a large proportion of us think, that science gives rise to technologies. And technologies affect societies, with societies as passive recipients of technologies. We do. Sometimes we like to console ourselves that we don't really think like that. And yet, in default terms, that's what we keep doing. So, for a long time, incoherently, I have thought that this was not right. That there was much more interconnectivity in these issues. But it was long, and given our nature's verbose conversations with Prabir, I hope he can hear me, over a variety of drugs, including but not restricted to caffeine, that it dawned on me that not only was technology a byproduct of the scientific process, but that the scientific process was a byproduct of technology. That is a simple notion that conversations with Prabir clarified for me dramatically. And I'll tell you a little story that kind of says that. But let me talk about the general point just a little bit further. I have a couple of students from ICER in the audience, and they will be familiar with this argument that I keep making, that until you have a technology that measures things interestingly, there is no way of beginning to ask about the causal mechanisms of that thing. Until you have a microscope, you have no awareness of the microbial life forms about which you can then begin to ask, what do they do? How do they live? Do they cause this? Do they not cause that? And so on and so forth. Until then, you're just making educated guesswork, which is really theology. The distinction is, so if there are Marathi speakers in the audience, they will understand this. The distinction between what I'm calling the kind of educated guesswork about stuff that we cannot perceive and experience, Maza Panduranga Panchendriya Rupa. If I can sense it, I can think meaningfully about it. Otherwise, again to quote the same poet, Vinda Karandikar, Shashpe Vinsra ho. And that I'm not going to translate. The first line is our goal focus is built around our sensory experiences. But it's not that the technology is developed with the intention of helping science and the scientific process. The technology is developed to offer practical solutions. And in that sense, quite remarkably, if you think about it, science and technology are tangentially related. They productively bounce off of each other in interesting ways. And a great deal of all of this, for me personally, comes from... he's got a black beard on his book and his... Anyway, this is all very dislocated. But, so, here's the next point of science, technology, and society. If we think about it, both science and technology are in a certain sense elite luxuries. In a certain sense, I insist, as part of the All India People Science Network, Delhi Science Forum, and People Science movements, that that's not fundamentally true. However, in practical terms, once we have specialized the process of scientific investigation, once we have achieved a certain level of capital investment in technology on the back of which further technologies will be built, inevitably two things happen. And again, I'm going to use Prabir's language. Because both of these provide surplus value, they are deeply attractive for elite expropriation. Now, it's very clear how technologies provide surplus value. Sure. How does science provide surplus value? And conversations with Prabir clarified for me that science provides surplus value not simply by incidentally enabling technologies, but by building models of causality, cause and effect, that allow predictions. And the more accurate, the less inaccurate predictions are, the more surplus value there is to the process of science independent of technology. And that is a lesson of the last 4 years between Prabir and me, when we had conversations on NewsClick, Prabir, weekly for a long time, about the COVID pandemic, about data, about evidence, Panchendriya Rupa Panduranga, about evidence, about the nature, the reliability, and the interpretative meaning of evidence, and what society will do with the interpretations of that evidence, completely independent of any intervention of technology development necessarily, because we will decide as policy what we will do and how we will do it based on some of these predictive models. Now, many of these predictive models, therefore, since they offer surplus value, are inevitably going to be expropriated, and the famous COVID models of the government of India that offered an extraordinarily rosy picture of how the pandemic was behaving and was going to behave is an exemplary case in point. So, all of this brings us to the politics that underlie these connections between science, technology, and society. One of the consequences of this elite expropriation of science and technology is that when subaltern movements of and on behalf of underprivileged, exploited communities, groups, and individuals arise, they tend to see, all of us, when we participate in these movements, tend to see establishment science and high technology as instruments of the elite, and therefore as opposition. And one peculiar and saddening consequence of this for people like Prabir, Vinita, me, Delhi Science Forum, All India People Science Network, is that a consequence of this is that the genuine, indigenous, grounded, community-inclusive, empirical tradition of the Panchendriya Rupa Panduranga, which is based on evidence, on collectives that are driven by mutual trust and mutual conversations, that build models of causality as communities that test models of causality. When will the rains come? Will we plant? Will we sow? Will we do this, that, and the other? Who, again, since there are students in the audience, I remind them, if there is a smallpox epidemic in the village, who are the people who are least likely to be affected, who should be told to go and do nursing? All of this is driven by empirical experience of the collective, models of tentative causality that drive policy. This is people's science. These are people's technologies in the broadest sense, because policies are technologies. And in all of this, the elite expropriation of science and technology drives movements for justice to reject them wholesale, to our detriment. A person who exemplifies the entire group of the All India People Science Network, who has taught me over the past quarter century to rail against this dying of the light, is Prabir. We need to reclaim these empirical traditions from the exploiters, from the elites. We need the Nirakhira Vivek as an absolutely essential and inalienable component of subaltern struggles for justice. And it is in the pursuit of this that a basic notion arises. And that basic notion connects both the nuclear power, nuclear energy story that I told you, the COVID story that I told you, and an in-between story that, again, Prabir will tell in less flattering ways to me than I will, of a little piece that he and I wrote, or more correctly, he wrote and I desperately modified, about genetically modified crops many years ago, attempting to point out that there are issues of science, there are issues of technology, and there are issues of elite expropriation and the exclusion of the commons, and that these need to be deconvoluted and thought carefully about, thought empirically about. And in all of this, what is fundamental is the issue of transparency and credibility of the empirical evidence, and transparency and even more credibility of the specialized analytical efforts that are being put in. In other words, are the data real? If the data are not real, nothing is credible. Are the data complete? If the data are selective, nothing is credible. When interpretations are offered, are the interpretations being offered on behalf of a government that has its primary interest in self-aggrandizement? Then the interpretations are not credible. Are the interpretations being offered by people who are primarily funded by crony capitalism? Then the interpretations are not credible. And in all of this, the last point, which is, how is this reaching the community at large? Who is helping this to go out there? And on that last point, I'll make two small comments. The first is, all of this is driven by media. And in media, I include what Sudhanga talked about as independent bookshops, because that's a form of media. And it is absolutely essential for not some version of neutral mediators functioning as media, but mediators who are on the side of the exploited, who are on the side of the underprivileged, and yet who are sufficiently committed to what I'm calling this underlying notion of credible, evidence-based Panchendriya Rupa Panduranga, not to falsify data, not to be selective about evidence, not to provide shaky interpretations as solid. And that is NewsClick. That's been my last lesson from Prabir about connections between science, technology, and society. NewsClick, remember, was started when the idea of online news portals was in its infancy. And we hadn't thought about it, and people like Vinita, we said, oh wow, really? This is going to work? What is this that we think might work? We were that vague about this. It worked to the point that the opposition felt it necessary to put him in jail for it.
Opposition to Prabir.
Well, our opposition. It is at this level that the issue of how do we get what we are talking about in terms of technologies, in terms of science, in terms of evidence, to people matters. But it's not simply having people-centric media that matters. It is how people-centric media talk to the community that matters. And the standard response of our community, certainly, and to a certain extent, Prabir's community of technologists, is to talk down to the community. What's it? Pratish, let me explain how the world is, and take my word for it. This sort of, this Yajnavalkya style of exposition is fundamentally antithetical to the idea of people's science. And one of the many things that NewsClick did, steadily as a drumbeat, ever since its inception, is to talk about these issues of science and technology without talking down to people. I have a great deal that I owe to Prabir, his insights, dare I say his friendship, and the uniqueness of an engineer who is a political activist who thinks multidimensionally. Engineers don't think particularly multidimensionally. I see engineers in the audience, so and because, as Prabir would point out, they're mysteries. So they're going to solve the problem, whatever the problem is. Sometimes what they think is the problem, not what you think is the problem. This is also true of physicians. Never mind. But it is this broader context in which both the titles that we are discussing, the issue of knowledge commons and the issue of the good fight, become completely appropriate and opposite. So, because he spent months and months in jail, and because I am astonished and pleased at how many young people there are here, this I am daring on behalf of Prabir by quoting lines written from another jail. शबखों से मुंह मोड़ न जाए अरमानों की रौ, खैर हो तेरी लैलाओं की उन सब से कह दो, आज की शब जब दिए जलाएं ऊंची रखें लो. Thank you. That's Faiz Ahmad Faiz, writing from Montgomery jail.
This is always not just Satyajit but also following Prabir. We have been together in many meetings, and this is something that keeps happening. If there are good, great speakers, at least he didn't get to perform as we were talking before because he was restricted to sitting there. But coming after a performer is always a challenge. And I have dealt with it with Prabir for 25 years and with Satyajit for 50 years. So at least there is some sense that I can handle it in my own fashion. So I know Prabir, as Satyajit also pointed out, from 1998, and we walked together for the first time after Pokhran 2. This was in month of May in 1998, and I remember on the streets of Old Delhi, many of us in Delhi, May, all of that, walking, protesting against the Pokhran explosion, and then various things followed after that. And along with Prabir, I mean, Satyajit also mentioned Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace, which emerged after that walk. And I have also been with Prabir associated in Delhi Science Forum, All India People Science Network. And in addition to that, there was also a small informal group of friends called Science Group, where we used to meet on Sundays, have a discussion on some topic normally chosen by Prabir, for about hour and a half, followed by beer and enjoyment. So that those were also great days. And now that both of us are not in Delhi and have come here, I'm sure I miss it too. I'm sure probably Satyajit also misses those. So I'm also very glad, as Satyajit said, that NewsClick is back on track. Not quite as much as it was earlier, but that one can see quite a few things that we used to hear, and I'll make some reference to that as we go. So with that, I'm going to talk about the Knowledge as Commons as the first book, and towards inclusive science and technology. That's the subtitle of it. And to my mind, what is the importance of this book, which is talking about science and technology related issues? Satyajit did refer to some of these areas in his talk, but I would say it is an uncommon discourse about science and technology. Let me explain why I think it is uncommon. Because commonly, I know even I have been talking about science and society. Many of you might also be familiar with that. But when we talk about science communication, we don't necessarily include society in it. And this I'm talking about, that's exactly the point I wanted to make, that it is something that we talk about, and we sort of invoke at times, if we are talking about science and society, our constitution, the scientific temper that is mentioned there. All of this we do bring in, and we have our own, all of us have our own and different styles. And while Prabir in this book doesn't necessarily invoke constitution, which is good. But he actively includes technology as an integral part of all the discussion that he is doing in the first book. And that's one peculiarity, one specialty about the book, I feel. The second one is about what I would call normal, that's also not normal, but science communication. As in the case of what we see written in media, people write about science, people write about science and technology, normally writing. So there are scientists who are writing about science, and there are also journalists. So when I think of scientists, I can clearly two names come to my mind. One is D. Balasubramaniam. Many of you might have read him. He has been writing for years on end in the Hindu. And he is very well known, very senior by now, very senior scientist, biologist, and he explains things extremely well. So what you need is communicating with people who, even if they have science background, they don't necessarily have enough background, or lay people who don't have even that much of science background. But such people should get to know what are the recent advances in science and so on, which is something that Balu, as many of us tend to call him, I wouldn't say this in front of him, however, but he has been doing extremely efficiently. The other name is, of course, we are in Pune. Jayant Nararikar is another name. He wrote both in English and Marathi, and the same logic that he communicated science to the people in the language, including science fiction, actually, Nararikar wrote. So that was a way of connecting science with the society. That's how I'm looking at it. But that's a different way of looking at it. And the strength is that there was communication. But the limitation was that almost all of these communication lacked the societal perspective, political perspective in those writings. Not that every piece of science that is communicated will always have solid rooting to for the society, but that is the point that most such communicators, good communicators, miss. There are also good journalists who tend to do it a lot more. They may not go into the depth of science, but they tend to connect with good journalists. Good science journalists do connect science with the society. For example, there might be impact on people, impact on environment, or government policies. All of this, many people would connect. So that's something that is a different perspective, I would say. But in this book, Prabir actually transcends the phrase of science and society in many ways, not just integrating the discourse with the contribution and impact of technology, but by stating his position very clearly, and I quote, and the reason why I have a laptop is quoting is very hard and I couldn't handle the two books together. So I thought this is a better way where I can actually read rather than finding page numbers and going through it. I actually just couldn't think of how to do it. So, so I'm quoting here. How do we look at science and technology? What role do they play in society? And equally important, what is society's role in developing science and technology? This was something that Satyajit was also referring to in his talk. These questions that have engaged me, as Prabir says, as a social political activist, but also and perhaps primarily because of my love for science and technology. And he further says these essays bring together all three interests: science, technology, and the society in which they are located. Unquote. So, this rootedness in the society results in an interesting comment about the hierarchies that Prabir makes in the context of science versus technology. And again, I quote, from the slave societies of Greece and Rome to the caste-driven society of India, the world of artifacts, which is, of course, an arena of the technologists like Prabir, has been separated from the world of ideas. Scientists and mathematicians could enter the world of ideas, but not those who worked with their hands. So the caste structure is very well mentioned in these few sentences that he says. And further he says, while making technological choices, we do privilege some sections and disadvantage others. In other words, technology choices are also societal choices. This is why the choice of technology cannot be left to technocratic elite. It is a societal choice. It is also why we need a people science movement demystifying science and technology choices. Again, to some extent, Satyajit had made reference to this. And this is something that, again, he mentioned, but because Prabir, Satyajit, and I, we have been together in many journeys, the repetition is inevitable. So, those of us who know Prabir have heard him saying with his tongue in cheek fashion, quite often, that he is, after all, an engineer or a mistri. And then, see, he says this, and then transcending his caste as a mistri and jumps to engaging with all aspects of science and technology. So that's Prabir. He will be sarcastic enough and he will go much beyond. One more important, extremely important point, which is about the title that I want to mention, Knowledge as Commons. It is about ownership of the knowledge. And once again, I quote Prabir, if knowledge is the common heritage of humankind, then science and technology as knowledge should belong to all of us as human knowledge and in the global commons. So it is something that we should be able to use, we should be able to handle. This stand of common knowledge and its ownership is the basis why Prabir, Amit Sengupta, who was our friend, very close friend and colleague who unfortunately passed away a bit too early a few years ago, and Raghu as in D. Raghunandan, and of course many other friends and colleagues as well, who fought against patents as restrictive measures, Bayh-Dole Act, TRIPS, GATS, other treaties, and so on and so forth. So this is something that is going against the knowledge commons, as one would put it. So with this, Satyajit also talked about COVID, and in that book, there is a chapter on COVID, which Prabir has written. And many of you would know, as Satyajit was also mentioning, that the attack on and the clamping down of news portal included one named anti-national activity. That was a commentary on various facets of COVID-19 pandemic. Satyajit used to be interviewed by Prabir once in a month, once in a week, or whatever the frequency was, very frequently all through the pandemic period. Satyajit commented, or both of them discussed at times, not one-way flow, but both ways flow, about evolving scenarios, the models that Satyajit was talking about, and any comment which was not in line with the government stand, unfortunately, was considered as quote unquote anti-national. So this got repeatedly referred to when Prabir unfortunately went in in October 2023. So this quote from the chapter on COVID is a clear statement on the importance and knowledge as commons. And here I quote again. We have demonstrated the ability to move in less than 12 months, the shortest time ever, from identifying the new virus to developing, testing, and producing a new vaccine at scale. And yet, after more than 2 years, about 30% of the world has not received even one dose of vaccine, a figure that rises to nearly 70% in low-income countries, unquote. As it happens, hoarding of the vaccines doses by higher income countries, hoarding until they went beyond the expiry date and hence becoming useless, not sharing technology, and of course many lower and middle income countries also not having adequate infrastructure, not just to store the vaccine and also of course produce the vaccine. All of these were major hurdles in establishing so-called equality in terms of getting vaccines. We still haven't overcome most of these hurdles. And even today, a significant population in lower and middle income countries actually remains unvaccinated for SARS-CoV-2. This is again another year practically which is gone. As it happens, sometimes peculiar justices, Omicron variant was an equalizer. It spread like wildfire through the world. So an infection rather than vaccination generated immunity in many parts of the world where vaccine wasn't available. Prabir further writes in the same chapter, intellectual property rights and WTO provisions obstruct us from manufacturing diagnostics, vaccines, and anti-COVID-19 medicines, highlighting restriction of uniform access to knowledge. That is what it resulted in. And the next sentence is, we have the ability to feed all the world's population, yet large-scale malnutrition and hunger persists, unquote. So this connect of sharing knowledge, science and technology with societal issues is what makes Prabir and his writings very different from many of the science and technology communicators. Prabir's 50-year-old affiliation with CPM as a political party gets reflected when he talks about technology development and self-reliance in independent India. Without being a member of CPM, I almost completely agree with his perspective. One doesn't have to be a card holder for one's thoughts. So when his perspective is, he talks about country raising protection barriers for home market and actively promoting indigenization in bigger industries related to infrastructure development immediately after independence. He also talks about successes and failures. So it's not just claiming what was right, but he also talks about successes as well as failures of public sector in meeting the simultaneous goals of industrialization and self-reliance. His criticism is also directed at proclamation of Atmanirbhar Bharat and the hollowness of it in terms of modern day technology development. So he also talks about many other things, and I'll move on to probably the next book, since there are many other issues that I could have said. But he one thing that he talks about is Dinanath Batra's school of historiography, and many things that that the stem cell research is what we had, existence of Iron Gate television because Dhritarashtra and Sanjay's story, and Pushpak Viman as the flying machine, all of these things. So the quote in that context is important in the sense, for them, as in Dinanath Batras of this world, reason has no purpose unless it endorses the belief. So some of these are sort of, like quotable quotes, and that is why I wanted to mention this as a quote. So now let me move to the second book. I'm sorry, I'm running late probably, but this book was published in October 2023. The time just before this, I think just before the publication, Prabir went to jail. So the first book was August 23. This was October 23. So the NRAM's quote on the book, which is up there, it says, a timely memoir from an Indian journalist under siege. I'm so pleased that siege is over and the man is there himself, even though he is online and not here in physical capacity. So I also would just mention that while I'm very, very pleased that Prabir is out, Arundhati Roy and Sheikh Shaukat Hussain are probably, I hope not, but probably on their way to jail, which is a sad thing to happen, but I couldn't not mention it. So we heard about Prabir and his unusual reputation when Sudanva introduced that he was incarcerated twice, once in the formal emergency and once in an informal undeclared emergency through which we were going through from 2014 onwards. So what I'm hoping is how much of change there will be in the next few years with some balance shifting in the parliament, and whether person who is a non-biological superpower, who was a non-biological superpower, will remain non-biological or will grow clay feet, we will have to wait and watch. I must say that this second book is much easier to read. In that, Prabir writes about his long personal journey. Despite knowing Prabir for 25 years, I didn't know many personal details. Those did come up, and there were one peculiar thing. I mean, I have heard from Prabir, 25 years is a long time, heard about Ashoka as a name, and then discovered that Ashoka is his wife's name, who died very early soon after their son was born. And interestingly, Ashoka's name is Ashoklata Jain. I came to know for the first time when I read the book. So many things one does not even know or ask, but that became peculiar information for me. As I said, I would certainly recommend reading this book, there is one comment that I would certainly make. There is a subtitle to this book as well, From the Emergency to the Present Day. And I disagree with the subtitle, primarily because there is a lot of information which comes about Prabir's life in the pre-emergency days, his JNU days, his going to the jail in the emergency, coming out of emergency, and then the elections which took place after the emergency was lifted up. So all of this is there as sort of 150 odd pages. And then there is the last chapter, which is, so a lot of it is up to that point, and the last chapter is called Living Politics. And I wonder actually whether Prabir had an inkling that his arrest under UIPA is imminent and he needs to finish writing before that. I haven't asked him this question. He may make a reference when he talks, but that chapter mentions formation of Delhi Science Forum, work after 1984, riots in Delhi, Bhopal gas disaster, many things that I know of, that Prabir and many others of our friends worked in. So this is something I wonder whether the remaining part is sort of cramped up in 30 odd pages, and whether he had intention of writing memoir part 2, or he may not now, because it's all there in the chapter, in that chapter. I'll there are many interesting things in the second book as well, and I am going to recommend that you should buy both the books for different things. First book you should not attempt to read in one go. Second one you should, but I would simply quote Prabir on the from the chapter of Living Politics, and to end my talk with. On a day-to-day basis, living politics means sustained work to build movements, to build a strong network, an alliance of movements. This, in sum, what I have learned over more than 5 decades. People's movements provide the larger world with its only rays of hope. And for me, in my life, they have taught me meaning and given me purpose. So the movements is something, people science movements is something that we should be working towards. And we have been a part of that along with Prabir and many other colleagues for many, many years. Thank you.
Over to me for responding to two speakers who I think have given me much more praise than I deserve, partly because I think I've come out of jail and they feel very kindly towards me. I'm sure if we had spent the evenings we did earlier, I'd have heard some other remarks as well. But all of that is good because it makes me feel okay, I have arrived. And I must confess that my arriving is, I think, as much a tribute to this government than the fact that these two books came out really in time. And to answer Vinita's question, which is, did I anticipate that I was going to be arrested? I was actually thinking that the way it's building up, that's a possibility. But that was not the main reason I stopped my pen there. It was also the fact that another 30 years, 25 years of what I did and so on was going to get very boring, not only for you who would be the readers, but also for me. So I thought it's time that I give the current generation a view of how we developed our ideas, what were the ones which shaped our thinking. And that is something which then they can relate to, because this generation, which is now living what we lived 30 years, 40 years back, which formed our thinking, this generation has also to understand that how our opinions, our politicization, our socialization is shaped. And that is shaped by history and the society that we have around us. So for me, my history was also the social history of my times and how they influenced me to think the way I did. And this is one of the things I wanted to lay before at least the current generation, that we leave them with something to think about, that how they should look at society and how they should look at struggles itself. So it was, in that sense, I thought, the more important part of it, because we are reaching the end of our active life. Soon we'll become fossils if we are not already have become one. The fact that the government decided to put me in jail is, I think, really the sense of their weakness rather than my threat to them. So I think if we take all this into account, the appropriate issue for me was, how do I draw lessons from my experiences, my witnessing of the movements that shaped me and others, that this is what I wanted to lay down. in front of my younger comrades and hopefully readers now. When Satyajit was talking and Vinita was also saying similar things, one issue that I had was when I became an engineering student and I was learning engineering, then I went and became a practicing engineer. One of the things that always made me think is that why is engineering thought to be applied science? In fact, by discipline itself, computers was really thought to be something like applied mathematics. That's how it was thought. Now, there is no artifact on which we talk about a science. Now, computers are artifacts, they're machines we have built. It's the only example of a machine building which claimed it was science. Why this happened? Because it was thought to be mathematics we are doing, and somehow mathematics also gets subsumed in science, which is completely another topic. So therefore, suddenly we don't have computer technology. It is located in engineering institutions, technology institutions, but it starts calling itself science. Of course, that also pained me that we as technologies seem to be losing our control over what we think and what we do. And there is an appropriation that we are applying what science has developed. And the reality is that, as Satyajit pointed out, without the lens, you neither have the microscope nor the telescope. And if you just used your own eyes, I don't think we would be where we are today. So this contribution of technology to science, and of course science to technology, is there. And I think Satyajit and Vinita both have looked at that already and talked to you about that. But I like to admit, I like to submit to you, since both the speakers who spoke on this are also doctors and scientists, that medicine, doctors specifically, are technologists. They're not scientists. They basically experiment as we do on various material. In this case, the material are human beings. And the idea is, of course, to cure them of disease. But this is not science. This is practice of healing. And this appropriately should be considered a branch of technology. So I'm going to leave it at that. Yes, of course, there is sciences, biology, microbiology, whatever you want to call biology today. Yeah, there is chemistry, all of that entered medicines. But I always thought that it's a misnomer to talk about doctors being basically scientists and not like engineers, which is what they really are. They are mysteries of the human body. That's my getting back at the two speakers. Remember, part two of writing my rest of my life, which I've compressed in 10, 15, 20 pages. I think I shall let that go. I think I have two books. If I write something, I really want to now write about history, and within history, locate technology. Because, one of the things that if I look at history, if I look at societal development as well as development of countries, then one of the questions that arises, why is it that history of technology doesn't become a part of this history? Why is it that when you talk of, for instance, the Arabs, everybody agrees that Arabs translated from Aristotle, from Latin, Greek, they transmitted, more correctly, mathematical knowledge from India. And this is what gets finally to Europe and ultimately rescues them, much to our cost, rescues them from extremely backward societies that they were in. I'm not going to go into the detail right now, but the point that I have is, why is it that nobody talks about the role of paper in transmitting knowledge, in keeping knowledge, copying knowledge. In fact, paper makes it possible to create cheap copies, distribute to various libraries, even possibility of having personal copies. This wasn't possible with parchment, which was extremely expensive as a medium, and therefore you did not want to waste that parchment and give it to scribes who could not transcribe properly, which is not there with paper. You can give it to somebody who doesn't write very well and hope you'll still create a copy which is okay. So the cost of transmission of knowledge, reproduction of knowledge decreases enormously with paper. But why is there no history about it? Why is that nobody talks about that the impact of the Arabs meeting the Chinese, they had battles, of course, meant also the ability of technologies to come from China into Central Asia and then rest of at that time the Islamic world. Why is it that when we talk about, say, the Central Asian Turkic groups, Mongols earlier, but they didn't really bring this to the rest of the world, guns, gunpowder, that this was again produced in China, and 9th, 10th century, 11th century, it starts coming to Central Asia. And suddenly you get the military power of Central Asia expanding. Of course, again, the Mongols did not use gunpowder for their conquests, but the later Central Asians, the Turkic tribes did. And that's what we have, for instance, in India, when you have the various Turkic tribes who come in and become emperors. You have the Lodis, later on you have Ghaznavis, the Lodis, and of course you have the Mughals, who are a combination of Turkic and Mongol tribes. Now, all of this was based on the fact there was gunpowder. Now, this part of it is also there, but very weakly. You have this kingdoms rise, societies rise, civilizations are created, barbarians apparently build empires, then become civilized. But the question of why is not addressed. So these are the things that I think should underline when you talk about what the colonial empires did in the world. How is it they came? And did it become those countries which are the backwaters for a very long time, suddenly become at the center of civilization? How does it happen? Of course, the ships play a big role. The Arabs had ships. They controlled Mediterranean for a very long time. They controlled the Southeast Asia to India, South Asia, to the Arab world trade. Because they had ships, the Chinese also had them, but at one point they decided to destroy them. But the star maps they produced, the compass, all of it comes also through the Arabs to others. And primarily the Arabs at that time did expand their naval empires or naval trade. They were not naval empires, they were trade. But it was that impulse to then take over the trade that brings the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean, and the rest is history. They are followed by the English, the French, the Dutch. The consequence for the world, of course, we know the consequences to us, but also the other consequences, genocide in the Americas and slavery, large-scale slaves being taken from Africa for the plantations in Americas. Now, this part of the history, again, is based on technology, and that, if you look at Western historical references, they would say, well, we had the age of discovery. Remember, Columbus was not going for exploration. He was trying to come to India. So, in fact, he didn't even reach the United States really, or the Americas. He reached the islands over there. Haiti was the island that he had reached. But forget all that. The question is, when they did come to Asia, Vasco da Gama comes to Asia, he even makes a declaration that we might have lost the Crusades on land, but we're going to win that on the seas. Now, this vision, combined with the fact that control over the seas, the oceans, controls the external boundaries of your country, and that allows, therefore, them to also control the countries. This understanding of the world, which we didn't have, we thought land empires are all that matters. Oceans are only for trade. It was not military, didn't have so much military significance. This is what leads to the fall of the empires that were there at that time. The Persian Empire, the in of course South Asia is the other one. China finally after the Opium Wars, and Ottomans last a little longer, but they also fall after the First World War. The real issue is the loss of the oceans to the seafaring countries, a few seafaring countries who had been able to marry military power to trade. Now, why I'm saying this, that the other part of the history that is missing in our accounts is the history of technology. And this history of technology is important because it has shaped societies in these countries. And we still today see it's the colonial world, ex-colonial powers, and the settler colonial powers, the United States, of course, are today claiming that, okay, we civilized you, we're going to give you some role, but we are going to still decide what should be the world order, that we will tell you what the world order is. So to that part of the history is now what my next project should be, rather than my writing further about myself. So I spent a little time describing this project because when I was in jail, one of the things I did do is take seriously that how do I give to my friends, younger friends and my colleagues, a sense that if you are looking at technology, we also need to look at how technology has shaped the world and how all these should be a part of a composite history where knowledge, artifacts, technology, and other civilization processes should merge together to give us a sense of history. And in this, the history of the oppressed, those who have been dispossessed, is as important, reconstructing that history as important as those of the empire builders, Alexander's, Genghis Khan, and others. Yes, okay, there were barbarians. I'm talking about the British, the French, the Italians, the Spaniards, the Portuguese. I'm not talking about who they considered barbarians. And of course, we also have our barbarism. It's not that we were nice people. We also oppressed sections of our own people. We also did a whole bunch of other things, which we should also record against whom. All of that needs to be given. But at the same time, if we want to look at society, we need to talk about technologies that have shaped history as well. And this was really my project in jail. And as I've come out of it, I've decided this takes precedence over whatever my memories are. So I'm going to stop here and hope that if you have questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. But I have a very easy cop-out that there are two very good people sitting there who can answer them directly. The question should really be given to Satyajit and Vinita.
So as a teacher, as a young teacher who is now handling students who are basically not even reading the material that they are supposed to be reading. No offense to the students here who might be reading. But especially because I come from a STEM background, STEM students are particularly reluctant to read anything which involves politics, which involves social sciences, and how STEM fields actually are in relation with both. So as wise and experienced members, what would you say to teachers, and how do we tackle this? And as a scientist, I work in climate change. which we know is, I think Prabir sir would know, sitting in Delhi, what is happening over there with the heat waves. It's also a problem which is considered as a science and technology problem, and there are all these people who are rushing to create technologies which will solve climate change, and not actually think about any of the marginalized, oppressed sections of the society who have not contributed but who are at the receiving end. So as a scientist, as a young scientist who do not actually get opportunities to speak up in places where policies are made, and very policies which are very, very beneficial to the elites, but completely ignores and invisibilizes the marginalized. How do we approach this particular era of fight to, ensure that at least this particular problem, which seems to be the problem of an entire civilization, deal with it?
There are no easy answers. It is very true that people who join so-called natural science streams are normally not so enthusiastic about reading. We also know as teachers that their ability to write is also going down with years on end. So this is a problem which is not just about higher education, which is what we are dealing with. It is a problem, of course, all over the country, which we have to think of from the school education onwards. There aren't easy solutions once you have reached that stage that you can suddenly improve tomorrow. So thinking about things is a different perspective. So it's also the case that most teachers are going through most teachers teach what is essential. So you are talking about elite teachers. That also you have to remember. So ordinary is bad word. Teachers who are, say, in rural areas, they are just about managing to teach. For them, thinking about any of these issues is also the same logic that you were thinking of, that they are underprivileged themselves. So it's not something that I can give you an answer and you can change. It is a system change, structural change which is required. And on the backdrop of what is happening to the higher education and entrance exam, what can we say?
So let me just offer a quick footnote counterpoint, not in disagreement but extending it. I'm always reluctant to stop at the point of saying, the system is awful, what can we do? This is profoundly disempowering. So here's a very small argument which we struggle with using in our own classroom. At issue in STEM teaching is the didactic nature of this is how textbook knowledge is. Textbook knowledge is scriptural. The simplest way in the classroom for individual teachers, no matter how disempowered, underprivileged, to begin to step away from that scriptural didacticism is to make a habit of saying at least once in every classroom session, and here's something we do not know that you are going to have to deal with. The knowing, agency, and the inculcation of agency matters for this. That's with no disagreements with what Vinita said, simply a footnote. For climate change, wise man with the white beard.
Okay, climate change is important to understand is also about energy. That when we produce carbon dioxide, which is what the main really driver of climate change today is, which is global warming. Calling it climate change was in fact a tactic of the energy industry to move away from the fact that it was really global warming that we are talking about. But the essential part of it is how do we stop greenhouse gases being produced, at the same time provide energy to the people. And for countries which are rich, they would argue, oh, we are already on this path, what can we do? We'll cut down, but slowly. We cannot cut down quickly. But you who are actually now developing, you should from the beginning not use fossil fuels and so on. So effectively what they are saying is, you please don't develop too much, you need more energy, that is not good for us. We will slowly give up all of this and go to green energy, give us 25, 30, 40 years. By the time you should not develop much, and we will sell you the technologies. In fact, we will come and set up power stations over there which are green, just that we will continue to exploit you like we have done earlier. So there is a colonial mode also in climate change discussions, and it is a struggle. It's a struggle of what should be the energy future of the world and how should it be made equitable. So I don't think we should take CO2 like we take other pollutants. It is not a pollutant, it's a byproduct which leads to global warming. By itself, a little bit of CO2 doesn't really cause problems. It's the amount we are producing that causes problems. And why we are producing energy in this way? Because fossil fuels are like any other battery. They are concentrated repository of energy. And unfortunately, till today, we are not able to reproduce in the battery sphere such storage. That if we can have batteries, we can store as much power, say, in a kg of oil, we would really say the climate change problem is not a major one. Unfortunately, we can't still do that. So there are technological barriers as yet, which I'm sure the next 10, 15, 20 years will reduce. But at the core of it is also who produces the greenhouse gases and who suffers the consequences, both within societies but also within poor and rich countries. And let's not forget, the American poor are also stuck to a path where even they consume energy at a level which is well above what even the middle classes in India or other poor countries do. So I think the problem there is not simply a class one, but it is also the kind of colonial regimes that we have had, and the fact that imperialism is still an active agent that rules this world. And it is their interest, when they talk about green energy, they start talking about something called blue energy, black, grey energy, green energy, hiding the fact that when you produce something which needs to burn carbon, emits carbon dioxide, it is not green energy, of course. It's not even blue energy. It is just what you are saying it is. It is actually emitting carbon dioxide. So all this talk about will go not for green but blue energy, will go for grey energy, is basically trying to hoodwink the people. Behind that is, of course, the idea, let's burn as much fossil fuel as we can till, it's impossible for us. Let's try and do that. The issue is really maximizing the profits of the companies that we are talking about. By the way, oil companies knew 40 years back, they had modeled all of this and knew that what was going to happen. In fact, their predictions were ahead of what the climate scientists were at that time saying. So that is where we are, and that's the battle. It's not simply about climate change. It is how do we produce energy, how do we make it available to the people, and how we let our civilization survive when these consequences of our current path are already before us. We've talked about already the heat wave that we are facing. It's only going to get worse in the next 10 to 15 years. Let's also face it. It's the poor that face the problem much more than the rich and the middle classes do. So I think I will convert the science issue also to an issue of who wields power in the world and which countries wield more power than other countries, and how it's an economic question as much as it is a climate science question.